Most people assume the lakes we swim in, the water we drink, even the rain that falls on us is pure. But it's been discovered that water may contain traces of a chemical called atrazine. It's one of the most widely used weed killers in the world, approved in Canada and the U.S. But in 2010, a California scientist dropped a bombshell. He tested atrazine on frogs and found it turned some males into females. As Alison Vuchnik reports, those findings launched a huge corporate battle that continues today, pitting one man against a multi-billion-dollar company.
It was the golden age of pesticides. World War II was over, and chemical companies were promising to make weeds and insect pests a thing of the past.
Weed control is a tremendous job. But today, modern chemical methods provide the answer.
For farmers who were producing more food than ever, it looked like the good times would never end, thanks to these new magical products.
They perfected Pesticide, the most effective weapon man has ever wielded against insects.
But as pesticide use grew, so too did concerns about massive increases in pollution, wildlife deaths, and even cancers. By the 1990s, pesticides were under increasing attack, and the most used pesticide at the time, atrazine, was getting a lot of attention. That's because atrazine was ending up in water.
Atrazine is the #1 contaminant of drinking water in the U.S. and probably globally, probably in the world.
In the water at night, we find Tyrone Hayes.
So we are on the Salinas River, and where we're at now, almost pretty much all of this water is from agricultural runoff.
In a river in Northern California, testing frogs for atrazine. Hayes is certain what is bad for frogs is bad for humans.
So for humans, there's studies showing correlations between atrazine exposure and low sperm count or low fertility, increased risk of breast cancer, increased risk of prostate cancer, deformities of the genitals.
But it's how Hayes got here that tells the bigger story. With a brand new PhD and a degree from Harvard, Hayes worked here at the University of California, Berkeley. Hayes was an expert on hormones and how they affected frogs. The makers of atrazine recruited him to study their product, a multi-billion-dollar moneymaker for the company.
You know, they really wanted to make sure people know that it was done at Berkeley and it was done by me. I mean, they really wanted to purchase a reputable laboratory, a reputable name to put a safety stamp on their chemical, I think.
But what Hayes discovered was so astonishing, it shocked not just him, but the world.
Males would develop eggs in their testes or develop ovaries in addition to testes or essentially turn into hermaphrodites. And later we discovered that sometimes they completely turned into females.
Males turning into females. A discovery straight out of science fiction. And all the more alarming because Hayes said it was caused by atrazine, North America's second most widely used pesticide, sprayed on everything from corn to golf courses.
Eventually it became very clear that they wanted me to manipulate data, that they didn't want the science to move forward, that they didn't want me to report the data.
Hayes says Syngenta, atrazine's manufacturer, needed him on side with his mouth shut.
These guys were telling me when I could and couldn't talk and what I couldn't do, but they wanted to. It was just, you can't tell me not to talk or not to publish.
What Hayes did next surprised even his fiercest critics. He declared war against Syngenta, the makers of atrazine and the world's biggest crop chemicals company.
Turns out atrazine is the largest selling product for the largest chemical company in the world. It's the #1 contaminant.
He gave hundreds of talks around the world attacking atrazine.
And it really comes down to politics and money, not about science.
Syngenta fought back hard, arguing his science was flawed.
Syngenta would start following me around. Individuals from Syngenta or their paid scientists would all come to the meetings and sometimes be disruptive even during a lecture or a talk. Or they'd stand up and yell things, or they'd walk around and start handing out pamphlets during a talk or things like that.
What does the science say about atrazine generally in the environment? We showed that atrazine consistently reduces growth rates in amphibians and fish.
At Jason Rohr's lab at the University of South Florida, atrazine is a hot topic.
The thing that I'm very grateful for is that Tyrone is around, attracting a lot of attention and deflecting it away from me.
Rohr evaluated hundreds of studies on atrazine. He's not surprised by Hayes' Syngenta story, saying it also happened to him when he raised concerns about atrazine.
They paid lawyers in full three-piece suits to show up and take copious notes when I gave my seminar at Illinois State University.
If you can destroy the scientist, then at least in the public's mind, you've destroyed the science.
Dawn Forsyth was the chief pesticide lobbyist for Sandoz, one of the companies that went on to become Syngenta. She helped craft the strategy for the pesticide industry in the 1990s.
That's job number one, is to destroy the reputation of the scientist.
Why destroy one scientist?
Well, it's one scientist here, one scientist there. Pretty soon, they're not getting funding. They're getting forced out of their organizations for being too controversial.
When she was on the inside, Forsyth warned about a possible link between atrazine and breast cancer.
My boss told me that if I wanted to keep my job, basically I couldn't say the phrase breast cancer for a year. So I was not allowed.
You couldn't say the phrase breast cancer for a year.
Right, so I was not allowed to bring up the issue. The tact was, rather than engage in a scientific argument, attack the character, ridicule the researcher, try and find somebody else who can speak for you scientifically, of course.
Hayes says when discrediting him failed, Syngenta tried to scare him into silence.
So it'd be a lewd comment, or it'd be a comment about my sexuality, or a comment about being lynched, or a comment about, you know, who's taking care of your wife? I'm going to have somebody take care of your wife, you know, threatening my wife and my daughter.
Hayes just kept pushing. The more resistance he faced, the harder he fought against Syngenta, sometimes in controversial and antagonistic ways.
I'll be like, you know, the guy who took the hood to Harvard, who's now bringing Harvard back to the hood, you know, and they would come up and, you know, say, well, you know, we've had you analyzed and you're crazy, and so I would be crazy. Professional meetings, you know, I gave an entire 15-minute talk at a national meeting, completely in rhyme. You know? And it was just I mean, I don't remember the whole thing now, but I mean, it started out with, I think it was something like, I bust a rhyme every time to keep the crowd engaged from the heart, from the start. Can you feel the rage? I entertain and maintain that I spread the knowledge, a little bit of some shit you can't get in college. And it went on for there, an entire 15 minutes, all of the data.
But Syngenta officials were not laughing. Shocking court documents would reveal what company officials were saying about Hayes behind closed doors.
When did you begin to get a sense that the company was organizing a campaign against you?
They kind of put me in the spotlight, and their attempts to try to destroy me, they've actually, you know, they tried to create a scandal. In a way, they kind of created a hero to some people.
Next, scientists say regulators are turning a blind eye to risks.
Every single study ever conducted on atrazine in amphibians but one is ignored by the EPA and Health Canada.
There was a time when the sound of frogs could be heard across North America, but those voices are disappearing.
That's clearly a sexually mature male. That's small, though. They're small here.
Berkeley scientist Tyrone Hayes says a pesticide called atrazine is to blame for reproductive changes in frogs, and even associated with cancers in people.
That's bizarre.
Hayes became atrazine's most outspoken critic. He was convinced the manufacturer, Syngenta, was trying to discredit him in hopes he would lose his funding and be silenced.
You know, I don't know what their strategy was. Maybe if they had just left it alone, it'd just be me and my few papers. But now it's this entity that they've sort of created.
The company's strategy backfired, an explosive discovery that made headlines everywhere.
When did you begin to get a sense that the company was organizing a campaign against you?
These internal Syngenta documents, released as part of a class action lawsuit, showed company officials discussed ways to discredit Hayes and exploit Hayes's faults, problems, even investigate his wife and do a psychological profile of him. We wanted to ask Syngenta about these incredible revelations. They declined an interview, but told us in a letter that Hayes' science is wrong, and the company has denied their officials made inappropriate comments to Hayes. They wrote, studies that claim to show adverse effects from atrazine, including those by Dr. Tyrone Hayes, have been dismissed by respected scientific experts and regulatory agencies. And they say that nearly 7,000 scientific studies have been conducted over more than 50 years to establish its safety for humans and the environment. What the letter didn't say is that Syngenta paid for some of that research, including studies written by this man, a scientist here in Canada at the University of Guelph.
According to the work we've done, and a lot of the other literature as well, there really seem to be no adverse effects on frogs as long as your concentrations are realistic.
Keith Solomon is a toxicologist. After studying atrazine for years, he says it's safe. He's even testified before the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, saying as much.
There's no strong evidence supporting a causal relationship between exposure to atrazine and adverse effects in amphibians, and if you wanted to include fish and reptiles as well, you could.
At the same time he testified in support of atrazine, his university lab got money from Syngenta to study the pesticide. Almost $120,000 in a recent 2-year period.
If Syngenta is paying for your research or part of your research, are you still objective?
Yes. Are the works of Beethoven and Mozart any less, good because they were paid for? We deliver a good product and we go with the science. We go with the data. We live and die by the data. We have to do that.
Solomon didn't just do his own research. He set about reviewing over 100 academic papers about the chemical safety and, once again, gave atrazine a clean bill of health.
I was very shocked.
University of South Florida scientist Jason Rohr is an expert on the effects of atrazine on amphibians. He couldn't believe what Solomon said about his science and virtually all science that condemned atrazine. So Rohr set about fact-checking Solomon's work, and he says he found 144 inaccuracies or misleading statements in Solomon's paper.
Yeah, I will let the viewership make a decision on whether, they think it was an accidental, a bunch of accidental mistakes, but that is a very high percentage of inaccuracies. What we discovered in a conservative estimate was that approximately 97% of those 144 inaccurate or misleading statements benefited Syngenta in that they suggested that the product was safe to biodiversity.
Does that concern you, that level of perceived error?
No, that's his opinion. Most of those were perhaps selective interpretation, and things get out of context, and that's possibly explains some of those things.
Well, again, the company wanted to give the appearance that there were independent scientists, independent academics out there, that these are people who are representing themselves as independent, and in fact, they're not. They don't have an independent opinion.
Only one of probably hundreds of studies on the effects of atrazine on amphibians met the EPA's quality criteria, and that one study was a study funded by Syngenta.
Rohr says that is the problem with the way the regulatory system works. The government sometimes relies too much on industry-funded science to get products approved.
Every single study ever conducted on atrazine in amphibians but one is ignored by the EPA and Health Canada. Yeah.
In fact, all the studies that found harmful effects from atrazine, including Tyrone Hayes's, were essentially discounted by the two agencies because they did not meet their quality standards. While Canada and the U.S. continue to debate the safety and the science, the European Union removed atrazine from the market more than 10 years ago, with minimal effects on crop yields. In the meantime, Canadian law allows almost double the amount of atrazine in drinking water than the U.S. Dawn Forsyth, former pesticide lobbyist.
The scientists who are researching despite what industry is doing to them, despite the pressures that they're feeling from their organizations, from their funders, these are the people that are the real heroes. They're the ones that are going to be making the difference, that will protect women, children, and everyone else from the effects of pesticides.
Coming from someone who used to work for the pesticide industry, that's quite a statement.
Yeah, isn't it? You know, it took me a while to reclaim my soul once I got out.
As planting season begins, Canadian farmers are about to apply atrazine to millions of acres of land across the country. Pesticide that will end up in drinking water.
If it's up to me, it'd be gone tomorrow. But I don't know.
Producing more food than ever, it looked like the good times would never end, thanks to these new magical products.
They perfected Pesticide, the most effective weapon man has ever wielded against insects.
But as pesticide use grew, so too did concerns about massive increases in pollution, wildlife deaths, and even cancer.
As Alison Vushnik reports, those findings launched a huge corporate battle that continues today, pitting one man against a multi-billion-dollar company. Most people assume the lakes we swim in, the water we drink, even the rain that falls on us is pure. But it's been discovered that water may contain traces of a chemical called atrazine. It's one of the most widely used weed killers in the world, approved in Canada and the U.S. But in 2010, a California scientist dropped a bombshell. He tested atrazine on frogs and found it turned some males into females.
Food than ever, it looked like the good times would never end, thanks to these new magical products.
They perfected Pesticide, the most effective weapon man has ever wielded against insects.
But as pesticide use grew, so too did concerns about massive increases in pollution, wildlife deaths, and even cancers. By the 1990s, pesticides were under increasing attack, and the most used pesticide at the time, atrazine, was getting